Greetings, and welcome to a case study of bad world building. For those of you that don't know, world building is the process of creating an imaginary world, whether it's an alternate version of our world or a different world altogether. When it comes to film, world building is establishing the setting in which your story will take place. The subject of today's case study is Priest, a 2011 action horror film about superpowered priests and their fight against animalistic vampires. By the end of this video, I hope you will have a better understanding of the negative effects bad world building can have on a story, and have a greater appreciation for good world building when you see it in well-written media. This video will contain some gory imagery, so proceed at your own discretion. The world of Priest is not well explained or well developed. Many important details about the setting and the characters that occupy it are either not mentioned or seem to contradict each other, which means that the stakes of the story are unclear. It can also be difficult to understand or care about the characters when we don't know how they got to where they are, what they're capable of doing, or what odds they're up against. In summary, bad world building hurts the setting, which in turn hurts the characters and the plot. Buckle up, ladies and gents, it's time to dive into the world of Priest and examine what we find. This movie is supposed to be based on a Korean comic book series of the same name, but they have so little to do with each other that they might as well not be related at all. As such, all information about the world will be gathered from the movie alone. Early on in the film, we are treated to a brief overview of this world's history. This animated intro is where we will be getting a lot of our information from, and so I shall read out a transcript of it for you. This is what is known. There has always been man, and there have always been vampires. Since the beginning, the two have been locked in conflict. The vampires were quicker, stronger, but man had the sun. It was not enough. And so it went like this over many years, the two races destroying not only each other, but the world itself. Facing extinction, mankind withdrew behind walled cities under the protection of the church. And then the ultimate weapon was found: the priests. Warriors with extraordinary powers, trained by the church in the art of vampire combat. They alone turned the tide for man. The remaining vampires were placed on reservations, and fearing the power of the weapon they created, the ruling clergy ordered the priests disbanded, for former warriors to be integrated back into a society that no longer needed them. And as the years passed, the few surviving priests faded into obscurity, like the vampire menace before them. Throughout the rest of the film, we learn relatively little about the world, and some of the things we do learn seem to contradict what we were shown in the intro. One glaring example of this is in regard to the vampire's physical abilities. In the intro, vampires are strong enough to tear through chainmail-clad soldiers like butter. Throughout the rest of the movie, however, they have nowhere near that level of strength. While it can be argued that the intro is a dramatic retelling of past events and isn't meant to be entirely accurate, it still sets up false expectations and establishes rules that the narrative has no intention of sticking to. After all, what's the point of having an introduction if it doesn't accurately introduce? After carefully studying the entire film, I have reached the conclusion that the vampires and Priest are not supernatural in any way. Unlike classic vampires, they are not humans who have been infected or cursed, nor does it take special weapons or substances to kill them. So I must ask, if the vampires are just animals without any magical powers, how do they find their way around where they don't have eyes? They might get around with hypersensitive hearing and maybe using echolocation like bats do, but that seems kind of unlikely since they have such tiny ears. You're not going to be getting good directional hearing with those. I guess maybe they could sense heat or smell their way around, but I don't see how they could navigate so precisely they could dodge bullets with those methods. Now, it might seem like I'm making a big deal out of small details, but I'm just trying to emphasize that not a lot of thought was put into the antagonists and how they operate. Speaking of which, why do vampires burn in the sunlight? Why do they need to drink blood? If they can survive on animal blood, then why would they choose to feed on humans when humans are so much more dangerous? Why does getting bitten by a vampire make you their slave? The only reason for these things seems to be that the vamps in Priest are supposed to resemble classic vampires. But from an in-world standpoint, there is no explanation as to why they are the way they are. Now let's take a look at the effects that vampires have had on the world, because it seems like there wasn't a lot of thought put into that either. If humans didn't stand a chance against vampires in the past, then how did they make it to the modern age? I would think that humans would be totally enslaved by vampires at this point instead of building highly advanced cities and making scientific progress. But since they were able to hold out long enough to make progress, how come inventing modern weapons didn't turn the tide against the vamps? It seems like the advancement of human weapons is meaningless, even though the vampires haven't advanced at all. I mean, why did people develop firearms at all if they're so utterly ineffective against vamps? Why not develop something that is effective against vampires specifically, like artificial sunlight? Good luck dodging beams of light. And it's not like humans didn't have the scientific knowledge to pull it off, as it's implied that they developed and successfully employed nuclear bombs. Making anti-vampire weaponry seems a lot smarter than nuking the planet, and it does seem like the whole planet was nuked because the only landscape in this movie is barren desert as far as the eye can see. Now, even if that isn't true and there is fertile land out there somewhere, then why aren't people living there instead? The movie makes it clear that people living in the wasteland haven't been able to grow food due to irradiated soil.
Residual radiation's still spotty, but the soil contamination's close to zero. With a little luck, we can finally start planting.
So how did they not starve as a result? Where'd all these fresh fruits come from? Are they getting food from the cities? I'm not sure how they could grow plants in the cities when the pollution levels are so high that sunlight can't get through.
There is no sun in the cities. Not anymore.
Vitamin D deficiency must be off the charts for the city dwellers, not to mention horrible lung conditions. Still, they're probably better off than the people living in towns in the middle of the desert with no water source. How is anyone still alive in this world? At this point, I think we can definitively conclude that very little in this alternate history makes any sense, but since we're on the topic, I do have one more question. Why did the church expend precious resources to build prisons for the vampires to live in?
Church teaches us that the eyes are the windows to the soul, and that since vampire evolved without eyes, it is a soulless creature to be eradicated.
So why did they decide to keep any of them alive? The church controls everything, so it's not like public outcry for vampire rights would have swayed them, especially since vamps have been the bane of human existence since the beginning of time. I think the real reason they made that decision is because the filmmakers wanted to have something that resembled Native American reservations to make the wasteland feel more like the Wild West. The problem is the concept of a reservation doesn't work when you replace people with animalistic monsters. And so, following the church's logic, they really should have no motivation whatsoever to keep any vampires alive. Let's talk about the priests. Why are they considered to be priests? Their singular purpose, as it's presented by the film, is to kill vampires, not to minister in the church. They may work for the church, but since the church is effectively the ruling government of all of humanity, everyone works for the church. Why is any of this important? Well, because they're considered to be priests, they have to take a vow of celibacy. There's no reason given by the film or explanation I can think of as to why they have to do this, other than it makes them seem more priest-like. This has a heavy impact on two of our main characters, priest and priestess, who long to love each other, but aren't allowed to because of said vows. The whole thing just seems like a lazy way to write character drama into the story where it doesn't need to be, and to add one more grim element into a world that is already very grim. Another thing to note is that the priests do not have personal names after becoming priests. They are all simply called priest or priestess. Not only does this come across as lazy character writing, it's confusing. I guess it's a good thing we only had one priest and one priestess as main characters, or else we'd have to start assigning nicknames to them just to keep track of which particular priest we're talking about. Additionally, it can be hard for us, the audience, to identify with our main characters when they don't have strong personal identities. Now that we've had a look at who our protagonists are, let's see what makes them the ultimate vampire hunters. First and foremost, it seems, are the priest's superhuman powers: enhanced strength, speed, and durability. According to Priestess, their power comes from God, but it isn't clear how they receive it and what the requirements are. We're told that the church collects potential priests when their talents begin to show, but we're not told what those talents are or what part the church plays in them receiving their powers. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the priests have come about very late into the war, and I'm just not sure why. If God has existed since the beginning of the world, and the church has existed for a pretty long time as well, then why are people receiving divine powers only now? Has something changed recently? Was God not interested in helping in this particular way before? Was the church doing something wrong? Did people not have enough faith? See, this is why it's important to know what the requirements are. When you're writing a story that deals with superpowers or magic, you need to have a reason why most people can't use them. What do our heroes have that normal people don't? In some stories, the heroes have to train really hard to develop their powers. If we get to see them train, then we can get to know them more as characters and watch them grow. It can also be very satisfying to feel that the heroes earned their power rather than getting it for free. In other stories, the heroes are chosen to receive power because they have noble character and can be trusted to use said power responsibly. In other stories, the heroes are born with their powers and have to learn how to control them. They'll also have to learn how to use their powers for good, or else end up like the antagonists. As for the priests, the only thing we know about them is that they have faith and received some kind of vague training from the church. And now we come to the single biggest problem with the priests: their horribly flawed combat tactics. You see, the movie sets up the priests to be the best of the best when it comes to vampire killing, and supposedly they were the sole reason that humanity survived. However, we're also told that most of the priests died in the war. In fact, the first scene in the movie shows us a group of priests getting absolutely demolished by vamps, and having examined this scene in a wider context, I feel pretty confident in saying that this tragic incident is entirely their own fault. All of this death could have been avoided if they had only brought the right tools for the job. It's time for a closer look at the vampire hunter's arsenal. So let's talk about the kind of weapons priests should be using, but aren't. We're told that priests don't use firearms, but we're never given an explanation as to why not.
What's with all the bullets anyways? Thought priests didn't use firearms.
We don't. They're for you.
Now, while the movie does make it clear that vampires are really good at dodging gunfire, it also makes it clear that our main priest is ridiculously good with a gun. I don't know why he's so good with a gun since he never uses one, but the fact remains that he has an inhuman level of skill with it. Later on, we see that guns are actually pretty effective when you're good enough to hit your targets. Shotguns in particular are very effective in confined spaces where vamps don't have enough room to dodge. Sure would have been useful here. What would have been even more useful is grenades. Blow up some vamps and collapse the tunnel behind you at the same time. Or, like I pointed out earlier, use UV spotlights. Vampires burn in the sunlight. Take advantage of it. Why do they not use modern weapons again? Is advanced weaponry considered to be unholy in some way by the church? No, that can't be true, since the church's regular soldiers use giant shotguns. In the end, I think the real reason priests are stuck using medieval-era weaponry is that the screenwriter thought it would look cooler. You know, if you want to have your characters use weapons from the past, you probably should have set the story in the past. Then the fight scenes could have looked cool and made sense. So let's have a look at what weapons the priests do use. As you can see, a large portion of the priest's arsenal is crosses. Cross-shaped daggers, cross-shaped shurikens, cross-shaped rope darts, and so on. Priest even takes the time to carve cross-shaped notches into his partner's bullets before they set off into vamp territory. So with so much emphasis on crosses, you would think that crosses actually do something to hurt vamps. But they don't. The film clearly demonstrates that using crosses to wound or kill vampires is entirely unnecessary and doesn't make any kind of noticeable difference. And I would think that the priests would be catching on to that after using them for so long. I get the feeling that the filmmakers watched classic vampire movies and got the idea that vampires are weak to crosses, but then forgot to establish said weakness when making their own vampire movie. So even if the cross shape of some of their weapons is useless, are their weapons still efficient in their overall design? Let's have a look at the weapons used by priest and priestess on their vampire hunting journey. First off, we have the cross dagger. You won't get much reach with this thing, and the crossguard seems kind of pointless when you're not fighting enemies with swords, but it does make for a decent throwing weapon. I'd say the cross dagger would be better designed if it had blades on all of the points, rather than just one of them, thus increasing its chances of actually sticking into its target. Next up is the double knife. It's basically just a knife that splits into two more knives. Knives are okay weapons, I guess. They still have short reach, though. Next, we have cross shurikens. Shurikens are not particularly deadly throwing weapons due to their size and weight, but since Priest has super strength and speed, he can throw them with a lot of force. This seems to work very well against regular vampires, as the shurikens slice through them with ease. Unfortunately, there are these really big vampires called Hive Guardians, and due to their thick hide, I'm assuming, shurikens are completely useless against them. So in the end, shurikens are situationally useful, but against big enemies you'd be better off using something with more penetrating power, like javelins for instance. Finally, we have the rope dart. This weapon has excellent range and an unnaturally strong chain. While it does seem to be pretty effective at taking down foes one at a time, I don't imagine it would be very useful when fighting a group, as it would just get tangled up on or stuck in whatever it hits first. That being said, we do see Priestess using it against a group, but these are familiars, not actual vampires. Familiars are shown to be hesitant to attack all at the same time, whereas vampires are not. So all in all, it doesn't seem to be a very good anti-vampire weapon. Now let's look at the priestly weapons that don't see as much action in this film. First, there's the Morning Star. Having both blunt force and puncturing capability, the Morning Star is a deadly weapon, especially in the hands of a super strong warrior. It is a bit short though, and requires you to be pretty close to the face-clawing monsters you're fighting. Then we have these cross axes. They look pretty good at chopping through flesh and bone, but they're still really short. Next, there's spears and glaives. Both have good reach and keep the user at a safe distance. I will say that spears probably aren't the best weapons for fighting multiple vampires though, since you run the risk of getting it stuck in the first vamp that jumps at you. Then there's the circular blade weapons. They do look like they'd be pretty good at slicing through flesh, but the reach of these weapons is absolutely pitiful. Probably why the guy who was using them died almost immediately. Then there's this crescent blade weapon. I have no idea what the purpose of the design is, and since the curved blade is broken up into segments with pointy ends, it looks like it would get stuck in whatever you were trying to cut through. Next, there's these oddly designed sai. Why are you using sai to fight vampires? The sai is a farming implement that was repurposed to catch and parry swords. Normally they aren't even sharp. Also, the sai is a one-handed weapon, so why does it look like the handle was designed to be held with 3 hands? Seriously, why is it designed that way? Wait, is that a scythe with a blade on each end facing opposite directions? What the heck kind of weapon is that? I thought you were here to fight vampires, not weeds. What are you gonna do, twirl it around over your head like a helicopter? You know, I'm starting to get the impression that whoever designed these weapons knows absolutely nothing about practical weapon design and just wanted weapons that look cool. You know what's cool looking and practical for vamp slaying? Swords are. What do these guys have against regular swords anyways? Well-designed swords are very versatile weapons with good reach, good cutting power, and the ability to hit multiple opponents in a single swing. I'd recommend using swords that are specifically designed for slashing. The falchion, the messer, the katana, and pretty much any single-edged curved sword are really good choices for the job. They sure would have been useful in that tunnel fight when you were outnumbered and on the run. Well, I think I've made my point here. Something I've always found cool about vampire hunters is that they really knew what they were doing. The vampire would be a seemingly unstoppable threat, killing innocent people and gaining more and more power. And when all hope was lost, the vampire hunter would show up and save the day. The vampire hunter wasn't just special because he was stronger than normal people. He was special because he studied the enemy and knew their strengths and weaknesses. He'd have special weapons and gadgets ready for the job at hand, and we, the audience, knew how he was planning to use them. The battle between the hero and the villain was like a game of chess, each player trying to out-strategize the other. The battles in Priest, on the other hand, are just super-powered kung fu fights with whoever being stronger and faster winning. There isn't much you can appreciate about the character's intelligence, and the fights are just way less unique or memorable. And so we come to Black Hat, the big baddie of the movie. Black Hat used to be a priest until he was captured by vamps during the tunnel fight. The vamps then took him to their queen, who let him drink her blood, transforming him into the first human-vampire hybrid. He is now physically superior to priests, and he can hypnotize people. Being the primary antagonist, Black Hat is one of the most important characters in the movie. Without his campaign to gather the remaining vamps and lead them to war against humanity, the priests wouldn't be back in action, and there would be no story. Despite this, we know almost nothing about him as a person, how his powers work, or who the queen really is. Details like these are very important when you're setting up your story. Without them, we don't really know what our heroes are up against and how likely it is for them to succeed. If we don't know that, then it can be hard to get emotionally invested in the conflict our heroes experience. If we're not emotionally invested, then how can we care about how the heroes are going to win? As such, having underdeveloped villains hurts the story. But what's even worse is when the little we do know about the villains doesn't make any sense. Let's take a look at our antagonists and see how they fare in this regard. So what do we know about the Queen? She looks like a bat for some reason, and she can turn people into half vampires. The rest is a mystery. How did she know feeding Black Hat her blood would do what it did? Has she ever tried this before? Is she intelligent enough to plan the invasion of the cities by hijacking a train, or is Black Hat the brains of the operation? It seems like the filmmakers were saving the details about the Queen for a later story, as the end of the film implied there would be a sequel. However, we never got a sequel, so I guess we'll never know. We will be forever in the dark, like the vampire menace before us. Now let's examine Black Hat. He's stronger and faster than a regular priest, which would suggest that he received vampiric strength in addition to his original priestly strength, making him double the super soldier. That would explain why the Queen chose to give him her blood instead of giving it to a regular human. Here's the issue. If a priest's power comes from God, then why would he get to keep it after being corrupted and falling to evil? Is priestly power a permanent physical upgrade that can't be undone? Maybe. Or maybe not. Priestess said their power comes from God, not came from God. So I was under the impression that the power was being actively given to them, kind of like Samson's power was to him. And maybe it was just poorly worded on her part. So even in the case that Black Hat's physical boost makes sense, here's what doesn't. His power of hypnosis. How the heck did Black Hat get the ability to hypnotize people with his eyes from a race of creatures that don't have eyes? It seems that once again the filmmakers have just copied a classic vampire ability and pasted it into a new context where it just doesn't fit. Seriously, why did they even bother giving him this ability? He only uses it once and it's completely unnecessary. He didn't bother hypnotizing this guy before biting him, so why do it to the girl? Oh, it's so that Priest would have time to stop him. The plot armor is strong with this one. Alright, I think we're done here. So what have we learned today? Humans can't survive without sufficient food and water. People that fight with guns are objectively smarter than people that fight with gardening tools. And well-developed characters are more compelling than poorly developed ones. These things might seem obvious, but apparently they weren't obvious to the people that made Priest. In the end, I think they just wanted to take thematic elements from lots of different genres and throw them all together without considering how well they would fit with each other or what impact their combination would realistically have on the setting. If any of you fine people out there are writing a story that takes place in an alternate world, I would encourage you to really think about the world you're creating. The more time and effort you put into developing your setting, the more potential your story will have to be good.